Hey, great to
Hey,
talk to you, Brandon.
yeah, good to talk to you again.
Yeah, today we're recording a conversation podcast style between Brandon and myself, Kaloyan, or Kal for short. And the idea of this conversation is two buddies pretty advanced on the spiritual part, we can say, talking about why we believe this thing is possible and why we believe it's very transformational and why it makes sense to talk about it and why certain things can be difficult and what these things are for us and how we relate to them, and also some pretty out there experiences on the path. We're going to touch upon also psychedelics. We're going to touch upon mental health and maybe some other relevant issues. So yeah, it's a very basic frame for this conversation. So I guess
Yeah,
maybe
we'll just kind of take it where it goes from there, but that's kind of the gist of what we want to cover.
yeah,
So, do we want to maybe get into like some of our background with spirituality to kind of introduce things? I mean, for me, it's been like about 8 years that I've been meditating and looking into non-duality and other stuff like that. So, and I think you've been doing it for about a decade or maybe a little longer. Is that right?
yeah, that's a fair assessment. So I've started meditating in like my late teens, so that was 15 years ago. I wasn't a very stringent meditator back then, but it was my first, I guess, attempts at meditation, starting with things like Osho back in the day, and then on and off, have been doing that for around 15 years. But things really ramped up for me in the last 3 years or so. Yeah, when this like awakening business started as well, you can call it
Yeah,
like that.
it does kind of go like in an it's like a slow progression and then it seems like exponential. I mean, that's how it was for me. Is that kind of what happened for you like 3 years ago as opposed to like all the time before that? It was maybe like a slight difference, and then the closer you get to like the end or where you're at now, uh for me, like, it really changed a lot. Maybe a year and a half ago, things started to go a lot faster. Did you
Yeah,
notice kind of a similar effect?
yeah, of course. I think you'd explained it very well. It was like a gradual buildup of some background thing in my life. And then suddenly one day I was reading a book by Jet McKenna and then suddenly things like really ramped up.
Okay, so do you want to talk about that first experience and what it was like and how like things changed pretty much hinging off of that moment and like where it went from there?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think that experience was, I was reading a book called Spiritual Enlightenment, The Damnedest Thing by Jet McKenna. So if you get your hands on that book, maybe if you like reading it, it's not a bad book. But what happened whilst I was reading that book is suddenly something really dramatic in my experience changed, and my experience suddenly started feeling very intense and very bright. And certain things suddenly started to like really make a lot of sense, like the fact that my life was in many ways um, at that point I was referring to it as a lie, right? Nowadays I wouldn't use that language anymore, but that a lot of the things that I thought of as real in my life, like a lot of the concepts that we use around who we are, how we relate to others, what life means or what life should be, etc., were all just really concepts or empty concepts, or a lie is a more brutal way of saying the same thing, I guess. But and that really like struck me on a very deep, heartfelt level where, damn, I'm actually pretty miserable in my life, even though my life is pretty good. And a lot of that misery comes back to, or like offness of life comes back to things being concepts. So you could say, on like in Buddhist language, in hindsight, I had an insight into the emptiness of concepts back then on the spot.
Okay, yeah, that
It
makes
shook me
sense.
up.
So you kind of saw like the conceptual framework of modern life get dismantled in a sense, and maybe like the solid, predictable way of seeing things in a really, it's just like a practical way of relating with the world. You saw that that wasn't the whole picture, kind of. So where did it go after that?
One thing to
Because
note
I know
first,
it. We've talked and plenty of times, and it's gone a much different direction. So can you like tell the viewers maybe a little how that journey went for you?
yeah, absolutely. And it's very important to know that this experience was not a philosophical experience. I didn't reach some philosophical conclusions. It was like a felt experience, and in that sense, much more powerful. And what it meant for me is like on a deep level, I suddenly developed a very deep striving to just figure out like what, okay, if my past life was a lie, what is out there that's like real. I guess I was influenced by Jet McKenna, of course, at that stage, because he uses some of these ways of referring to things. And I suddenly found myself in approximately 2-3 weeks time in a, so the first 2-3 weeks time were quite like hyper, so hyper energetic, just like slightly maniac in certain sense. Like also my sexuality was quite high, you could say, and that's like
Yeah.
2-3 week period. And then after
So
that,
like in the like common framework you and I have, we would call that like the arising and
yeah,
passing away insight stage, right? In
yes,
this like, you know, Theravada Buddhist four path sort of model scheme, the stages of insight. So like
yeah,
arising and passing away is kind of like that initial jump into it. And that does come with like a lot of that, like maybe a rise in energy, creativity, um, maybe some blissful experiences or new sensations and stuff like that. It's kind of like the fun first like jump into the swimming pool is maybe how I would say it. Um,
yeah,
but yeah, it also comes with a little bit less like stability. I think, I mean, more in for some people and a little less for others, but it seems to like break up your normal patterns of kind of your ego relating with the world too. I think it introduces some new activity, right? That you didn't really have before, maybe on a personality level too. Might pronounce certain things.
yeah,
So you were in that for a while. Where did it go after that? Did you
yeah,
take the typical downturn that a lot of people see? I mean,
yeah.
uh, that's
It
kind of
did.
what
It
happened for
did.
me.
I think the way you described it is very well. It's like a honeymoon of awakening of the rising and passing stage. And it was quite typical for me in that sense. And it was typically also, as with many others, followed by what is referred to as the dukkha jnanas in the Theravada model, or like more famously on the internet, thanks to some random internet dude that wrote a book about it called The Dark Night, or The Dark Night of the Soul. And that's a period that's like a really low period. It can be quite dramatically low for some. And my first dark night was really quite dramatically depressive. So suddenly energy gone, nothing makes sense. It feels as if the world is like opening up literally as I walk, and I'm going to fall through the floor. Lots of fear and core issues and trauma stuff bubbling up. And very, very scared, and I was like very, very depressed, and slightly, I guess you could say from the outside in, people like my wife weren't very sure that I was really sane at that point. I did look a bit insane. And that's why you touch upon.
Yeah.
That's
And
why,
the thing is, like, you typically have had like really probably kind of typical or like good mental health, maybe not
yeah,
like a bunch of, you know, psychological issues that you had to deal with or, you know, things like that, right?
no,
Beforehand. But
not,
it was like this experience itself and this sort of transformation on this insight, you know, path. It did a lot of this to you. Like it wasn't much of an issue before that.
Exactly. I've never had a history of like mental health issues, or anything that would seem out of the normal. We all have a lot of trauma and certain, dark patterns and shadows. But I didn't have a history of like mental health, no ADHD. I'd probably score neurotypical on most of these tests as well. So I didn't have a history of that. So, and I'm in my 30s, so it was quite weird in many cases, like someone that's in their 30s in a stable life situation, no previous history of any of these conditions, suddenly lands up in spiritual weird territory and presents as insane, mildly insane, or like, I don't want to offend anyone, I'm not an expert on like diagnosing mental illness, but I would probably get diagnosed with something like mildly bipolar, at least if I did go to a clinic at that stage. Yeah. And probably like depressive as well. And it was a very challenging period for me personally, because I never actually had to deal with anything so intense in my life. Really did feel like getting my face stretched a lot. And then, because I'm interested also to hear how things went for you, but just very briefly, that process continued for me in the next uh, almost 3 years now, and it brought to like hugely transformational aspects, which ultimately mean this is a real thing, and it can be quite transformational and positive. And there are difficult periods on it, and we'll talk a bit more about some of these difficult periods right now. I'm really curious also to hear yours, but ultimately it can be like a good thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree that overall it's ultimately a good thing, or I would say can be a really amazing thing, even. But like for me, it was a very similar sort of thing, except there were. I mean, you didn't. It probably applies to you too. There were probably more ups and also downs than just like one up phase and then some down and then kind of coming back up again. There was probably more up and down, right, for
Yeah.
you. So for me, it was a lot of the up and down. I would go into these, you know, heightened states where these spiritual sort of, you know, common spiritual themes and stuff would just kind of come to me. And the first like notable one that kind of started the process for me was when I was about 18 years old. And at that time, I actually did get diagnosed with bipolar disorder type 1. And it was a really strange event for me, in a sense, and for everyone else around me. It was like my personality changed significantly. But I've noticed some people with bipolar disorder talk about um, their episodes in the sense where it doesn't feel like any sort of spiritual thing to them at all. And then I've heard others say that it kind of did, but they didn't really come out of it with like, I guess, a feeling like they had to pursue this path of like down the spiritual path. But yeah, there are some who it's like very spiritual for, and it seems to line up more with like traditional awakening models. And then there are some people that I've talked to who have like a bipolar diagnosis where it's like not really that at all, or they might even get mad that you say it was like had any positive spiritual element to it. So like it was pretty intense when that first happened, but I'm not even sure if I would call that. I mean, it depends on your definitions and what your requirements are, but maybe that wasn't a rising and passing away alone. Maybe it was some type of mixed thing. And I would say as like I started to do more spiritual practices and stuff, eventually the what would started out appearing more like mania and bipolar disorder turn into like the arising and passing away of these awakening models. It's like the closer that I got and the more insight that I got into spiritual um things around awakening, the experience started to change more and more in that direction for me. So I think at the beginning it might have been like some elements of spirituality. I know mainly like oneness, love, those were all touched upon, and at the time, I mean, probably rather profoundly for most people. Today, I wouldn't really say, relative to the experiences I've had, since then, that it was really the most profound thing. But at the time, it certainly was. And I did get like the energetic increases that you described, the increased like libido, sex drive, similar things like that. And yeah, big personality shift for sure, at least in that time frame, different than what I used to be like. And I think bipolar and also the arising and passing away and like dark night stages or the dukkha jnanas, there it it is kind of like you get pushed into this higher possibility and kind of way of feeling things. And for me, it felt like once that was taken away, you have like normal life as it was, and that itself feels kind of empty in a sense compared to maybe like that spiritual high that was there for a while. And it feels like almost the lack of that connection, um to like some spiritual sense or feeling, kind of creates the dukkha jnanas a bit. That's kind of how it feels for me, that the lack of that energy or whatever positive things happen to be there and like the arising and passing away, to me that was a lot of what leading into the dark night stages was kind of about. It was feeling that disconnection, um, and it went up and down in that for a while, and then uh, eventually I started to reach the insight stage. After a number of years, I got into this rather deeply. It's called like equanimity, and the stage is kind of near the tail end of the whole, system. I think it's 16 different stages, isn't that right?
Yeah.
So uh, I probably had reached equanimity before a number of times while all of this was going on, but as far as a stage, but I think I have heard some people describe there being like a high equanimity and then like maybe a less um, pronounced form of it in a sense. Um, Although I've also heard some people say it doesn't quite work like that. But either way, like maybe 2 years ago or so, I started to go into the phase where it was really like it's described in that specific Buddhist awakening model, where it's more like that equanimity. And really like the manic and depressive side of the bipolar disorder both kind of started to go away. And then also I just started to feel a lot more peaceful and just like okay with a lot of pretty much everything. Um it was an interesting place to be, compared to like the ups and downs as far as like in a spiritual sense go. And then after that, um you know after being in that kind of equanimity stage for maybe 2 or 3 months, I had my first cessation, which is what they call in that specific model, like kind of your first taste of awakening, like proper, maybe you might say. Like the rising and passing away is kind of like an appetizer, and maybe like when you get the first cessation, that might be like your first bite into the main course of the meal. I don't know. Is that, how does that sound to you? And does that trajectory line up much with what happened for you?
Yeah, that sounds very reasonable, and I do believe Yeah, the rising and passing is significant in the way you described it. It really changes something, right? And then the first cessation, I didn't actually know when might happen. I didn't have access to these models, but it does seem to change stuff for people, is what I've heard as well. So it's fair to call it like a first bite, I guess. Ultimately, like people that are not into models, I guess the way I would like explain it to, you know, a random Joe on the street that really doesn't like models is, okay, there's this really high thing, rising and passing as we call it, but you can call it something different. And this thing really sets you up for life on a spiritual trajectory, and things are going to feel different for you. And likely it can be followed by a low period. And if you're, you know, very unlucky that, or I don't know, maybe lucky unlucky is a weird way to talk about it, but it can get really dark after that for a while. So it's good to have this advanced warning, and then you're up for a process that can be hugely transformational. If awakening is a good label for that process and you want to use that, you can use that label. Other traditions or other people can call it differently, but it changes how you relate to the world, to, you know, concepts, to things like love and like your place in the world as well, how you relate to other people. So it can be hugely transformational. So it's overall a good thing, but it will probably be very challenging as well. There's going to be ups and there's going to be downs. So that's kind of like a very short way of like saying it for someone that's not into models. And because you and I are into models and we're familiar with the Theravada models and some of other models and takes related to this. And the funny thing I discovered is there was a period when I was really into these models, and they really made a lot of sense and were important somehow, especially around normalizing the experiences. Not so, I thought they were also helping me to like navigate the different stages, but the reality is, in my particular case, it was probably more around normalization. The other aspect of it, very helpful also, like just talking to others about these things is also helpful to have some background knowledge of the models. But in reality, the process has like its own inertia. Models or no models, it's going to do what it does. And it feels like,
it's always going to be way more rich than what a model will say like it's going to be like. And it's not going to be as linear in a sense. Like there might be just some different variations to how it's going to actually happen for a person. But I mean, I think in general, the model does a pretty good job of kind of showing some similarities and how the normal trajectory is. So I guess, yeah, do we want to talk about kind of what awakening is like beyond like that leading up stage, like where it goes afterward?
Yeah, we should probably talk about that. And again, here, you know, we're talking out of our personal experience and like what we've read and heard from others, our friends, and like other people online and other sources as well. But for me, awakening is, you know, has like multiple components. Like nowadays, I'm more a fan of a broader awakening definition. That means awakening that contains not only non-duality, but also some other aspects of it. You can call it like psychoenergetic purification or healing or whatever you want to call it. Some people just define it as the narrow non-duality. And that's a fair point, as long as you point out that there's also other stuff that needs to be looked at beyond just non-duality, because some teachers or like some famous, you know, awakened people apparently just kind of got a bit stuck thinking this is just it, and then they had like some shadow side still to look at. Yeah, but what we mean by these are, non-duality. There's no separation between me and world. It sounds funny because in the conventional sense, this is Kal and this is the wall, right? But what this refers to, of course, is that in experience, there's no separation of sensations that are me and sensations that are not me. In my pre-awakened state, I was heavily identified with thoughts. So thoughts were always a me. Certain sensations like emotions, especially heavy emotions, were always a me. The anger that I feel, that's me. That's like a self. That's like some sort of thing. And then the thoughts, all the thoughts, I'm thinking the thoughts and all these things. And I had a very strong sense also of like master controller entity somehow being up here and like somehow telling the body what to do. And now my current experience after like many shifts is there's no such thing. There's just sensations. So there's sensations on the forehead, there's sensations on the arms, there's like blinking, the visual field, hearing, all these things. There's emotions, there's like slight anxiety maybe here because we're recording a video and I'm just like slightly anxious.
Yeah, new on camera, right?
New on camera, how does my hair look? And all of that is just sensations. None of that is a me. So in that sense, nothing is a me versus not a me. And also the felt sense of like hands just move by themselves. The mouth just like says things. Everything just happens by itself. And that's like what people refer to non-duality, I guess.
So, and this is something we could get into. Like I would say there are different degrees of something like the blending of like these two, what were two grounds of like a self and a world that the self is operating in, things like that. Or even maybe with like, some people call it non-doership, like what you're describing, like things do themselves. It seems to me like a lot of these different aspects of this like typical like non-duality type awakening, that it can be to different degrees, like that you sort of are with it. And maybe like the first thing is there might be people who conceptually like can get the idea and like think it makes sense. But what we're really talking about here, I would say, at least for myself, and I mean, I'm pretty sure from you, from the conversations we've had, it's more of a change in perception and the way that reality actually feels than just an understanding. So I think, would you say there are different kind of degrees of getting this? If we just talk about like this main insight of the separation between like self and what is not self, going away, can you talk about how that was for you, and if like there were different kind of levels to that, like on an experiential like direct way for you, how it changed?
Yeah, it's a very good point. It's definitely degrees to it, and it's definitely a process. It's important to note that everyone starts from a different place. So our felt sense of a self pre-awakening is different for everyone, because it ends up like that. Spoiler alert, there was no self to begin with. The self was always like a construct. So certain sensations were misperceived to be a self. In my case, it was the thoughts and the master controller entity here and certain emotions. But let's say for other people, it's...
Real quick, I just want to say, it's like, it seems like those sensations that get perceived as like a self or something, the way of interpreting experience that way like creates even more sensations to kind of like back up that experience and like make it feel real. So it's like there was not a self at any point, like it was kind of thought, but it was like the interpretation of that and feeling like that is the case actually added sensation, like kind of really subtle sensations, right? That are like kind of congealing certain things together. It's a really weird thing to try to describe that. And it's hard actually, like after awakening, to me, like I feel like the further you get away, or like the longer after like you went through it, like the harder it is to describe what it used to be like, because you don't even have access to it.
You don't remember anymore. Yeah, and it's very true. It was like certain sensations were creating like this conjunct effect in what you described. And it's different for everyone. For me, it was like right here, people I've heard talk about like their self being located in the chest. Other people are like, well, my whole body was the self somehow. Other people like like different nuances and versions of that. And ultimately that comes to show you that it's a construct that's slightly different for everyone else. Some people like me were heavily identified with thoughts. I've heard people say they never really felt that thoughts were me, but they had like a strong sense of agency. That means like telling the body what to do from like maybe a vantage point here or something like that. So the starting point for each person is different. Spoiler alert, there never really was a real self, but it was like a construct that was like misperceived slightly differently in different ways by different people. And as that process unfolds, the seeing through this like misperception, certain things fall out first. Let's say for me, at one point I saw through thoughts being a me, but I still had a felt sense of agency in certain ways. So thoughts were no longer me, but I did have like a felt sense of agency. But in certain, that means like when I move the arm, it's like me somehow telling the arm to move. But then in other situations, that felt sense of agency was loosening up. And that means, the arm kind of moves by itself. The sensation of intent to move the arm being just one more sensation and not a me as well. So in that sense, experientially, it feels as if at first, it moves itself. I'm not like telling it what to do. It's a bit weird. At least was for me a bit destabilizing, and others have described it in similar ways as well, I've heard. And then eventually everything gets seen through, or some people, like me including, get to a stage where they feel like nothing in their field of experience feels like being separate. And that's where it all kind of like, it feels like it all sinks into like non-dual mode of perception, everything being just experience, just like one giant blob of experience that's just doing its thing. And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's ultimately function in a very similar way for me. I would say, like, for me, the realization of like the illusory nature of agency came sort of later on. I would say, like, so I actually had a sort of, deepest up to that point, like no self insight, actually, like I think a couple days before my first cessation. And then that happened, and then it was kind of like feeling like it was gone. Uh, and then I think that just for a period of time, maybe leading up like to 6 months or a year, it was kind of like more small aspects of this like puzzle of operating in this new way started to get shown, and it like seemed like a deeper and deeper no self, like a closeness with that sort of way of perceiving reality. And eventually, like, once that was seen through enough, the agency feelings fell away with it, kind of their own accord. And some of, like, I'm trying to think of one of the, like, the later things that I think fell, maybe like right before, around the same time or slightly after, like the agency was going away, was actually my first time seeing into the like true emptiness of sensations. Basically, like, what you're experiencing right now is ultimately all you're experiencing right now. It's all you have access to. And in the conventional, like traditional way of experiencing life as a human being, it's more, we always have these concepts of there being something like behind what is being sensed. And like when that fell through for me for the first time, it actually like took away my background like feeling with gravity, that I was like being pulled down. And then it just became like only like the tiny sensations on like the bottom of my foot or something were actually what was there as far as gravity might be concerned, like on an experiential level. It was realizing like it's really just the sensations themselves that are present. And even in thought, I would say we're including that as something that's based on a certain type of sensation. I will say that feeling that in relation to thought is like a much more subtle part, at least it was for me, to sort of actually like feel the way the thought kind of forms and moves. It's a different thing, but yeah. And then other shifts and things kind of happened for me, but it did seem like more pieces of the puzzle were kind of seen clearly. And then eventually, like, I don't know, several months ago, it seemed like they all kind of joined to meet like this conclusion where there was just this new kind of baseline way of operating that was just there all the time. And these different elements were just always the case as far as how my experience was functioning from then on. Um, so
Mhm.
what
I really
what
love
thoughts come up?
I really love the way you put it, and like very eloquently. And yeah, eventually it does reach a stage where this thing is available, this way of perceiving reality is available without any effort, without any practice. It just gets locked in. And we said that it's hugely transformational. In what ways was it transformational, or like why do you feel it's transformational for you?
Um, I would say like first and foremost, like the way that it's been transformational is that like the primary way that it's been transformational is that it has changed my relation to suffering, painful sensations, and also it kind of changed the way, yeah, just when anything used to be difficult as far as like a typical practical life experience, if it was difficult or not my favorite thing to do, that was like a much heavier thing before this process took place. And it relied a lot on the very strong sense of there being an individual here that is like a certain way and maybe threatened by other things or other possibilities, and also feeling like that strong sense of self, and you have some sort of painful sensation, or let's say a sensation that was interpreted as painful typically like beforehand. um these sorts of things kind of lose their hold as far as being like objectively like painful things and horrible things that can't be accepted. After this process took place, even things that I would have, even like a physical sensation I would have interpreted as painful, had a lot less of that bite to it. But the mental component of like what was really amplifying the negative aspect of that experience based on whatever is going on, a painful emotion, painful physical sensation, it was really changing the way that the mind related to these things, because when in a sense the whole field of experience is on a sort of level playing field with itself, as far as what is the property of a self, or how, or is there something in control that's like in opposition to everything else. um it just reduced a lot of suffering and eventually led to a lot more mental stability for me as well, that I don't know if I would have had much of a chance at getting if it wasn't for a process like this one, or something that worked in a really similar way. um so I mean, as far as like a practical benefit, that has been very large. It also just makes life and experience very fun and new, and it's just a new way of relating to the world that not only like reduces the bad things, but also seems to bring in new interesting elements of experience, um, from time to time. And it just seems like a more pleasant way to live life at the end of the day, if we're going to speak like very practically, just how the experience is. um and of course, like it definitely opened the doors to more radical sorts of experiences in like a spiritual context that were, just incredibly profound and mind-blowing. And so there's that aspect to it. But even just on the very basic, like every day-to-day level, I'm just happier and feel far more peaceful. I'm more accepting. And I think things like judgment for others, or things like that, a lot of these things have just been reduced kind of by large, quite a bit. So what about you?
I really like what you said, and it really hints at something deeper as well, which is that awakening goes beyond just this non-dual perception shift that we talked about. And for me, likewise, the non-dual perceptual shift, like there being a me and not a me, just made a lot of like experience and pain, and like pleasant sensations being more pleasant, more clear, painful sensations more bearable in a sense. Like I can really open up to them and all these things. But what you very much hinted at as well is like other aspects of it, somehow seeing that this is all just one interconnected system, there really not being a me or another, somehow opening up to like a certain compassion and care for the world. And likewise, certain energetic shifts and like hard openings for me meant that I became a much more caring, unconditionally caring person in many cases. And like just driven a lot by that like more altruistic way of relating to others in the world than I was before that. A lot less judgmental, like you described, so a lot more accepting of others and their expressions, a lot more trusting, somehow deeply trusting the universe and like life, and like you can call it God, I guess, is a
I would
synonym
say
of the universe.
trusting life or experience itself has definitely been a big part for me. But yeah, keep going.
Yeah, and all these things are for me feel like important part of awakening, because some people will say, well, it's just about non-duality, and that's in a sense, if you define it like that, I'm okay with that definition, as long as you say the broader process that's happening for people that go through it can open up also these other aspects of unconditional care, unconditional acceptance, or like less judgment and deep sense of trust and interconnectedness with the universe, and all these aspects of it. And that really changes how people, how I relate to people. For example, so my colleagues at work will say, well, you become a lot more caring, you become a lot more accepting, you become more a better listener, a better because I'm a manager at work, like a better manager in certain cases. And my wife likewise would say, well, you were a bit of a douchebag before that. Was right now you're still sometimes a douche, but less frequently. Again, like a plethora of energetic shifts just really rewire, I guess, depending on how you want to relate to it. I relate to it in a more woo-woo way, so that I like energies and stuff. But if you want to like relate to it in a conventional way, you can say, well, it rewires our nervous system. To me, it's clear that it's not just purely a physiological process in that sense. Other things like energies are involved. But if you don't believe in these things, or are not a fan of that word energy, as here I said it again, then you can say, well, it rewires our nervous system and our parasympathetic nervous system as well, in ways which make us better human beings. All else equal, they make us a better human being. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's been a lot like my experience. A lot of those things. And there is the idea that like sometimes it doesn't necessarily make someone a better person, like from like a traditional sense. It might not change them that much, but I've definitely seen that it has changed a good number of people who have gone through it, describe similar things like this. So it's interesting to see that maybe like for some people it doesn't have as much of an effect on how like their like maybe personality is functioning in the world. Um, but yeah, so I think maybe some of the things you mentioned at the beginning, we were gonna look at maybe the dark side of all of this, or
Yeah.
maybe some of the harder experiences, or maybe just get into the experiences in general a
Yeah,
bit
let's,
more.
yeah. It makes sense to talk a bit about experiences, because one of the things that I'm really passionate about is normalization, because these things happens to a lot of people. It's still somewhat rare in the world, but a lot of people end up in these situations even without any context. My brother, my like high school girlfriend, and a bunch of other people that I know of just landed in this territory without any meditation, reading spiritual books, or any form of training of sorts. And this is, of course, can be challenging when you like not aware. And there's also a lot of myths around like what experiences should be. It should all be blissful and all that. Just talking to a friend today, and just like so many teachers even out there don't mention the difficult experiences that just happen as part of this process. So maybe we should talk a bit about these difficult experiences. And yeah, I don't know, what is the most difficult experience you've had that you feel comfortable talking about in front of others?
Um, Probably the most difficult experience I had um was I had this was like maybe 6 months or so after like the like first cessations happened for me. But yeah, for a period of time, like my baseline state of consciousness started to get much more profound. And yeah, like we've said, like the way that the world was being perceived, all of many changes happened in relation to that. um and but eventually I got to this point where I had a very profound experience, that was like, I don't know, it was kind of like maybe 10 psychedelic trips like in one like 4 hour period. Is kind of how it felt. And but they were like very intense, and much more intense than anything, stuff like I've tried psychedelics and before, and sometimes even at kind of high doses depending on who you talk to. Some people would say that's a crazy dose, others would be like, oh, I've done a bit more than that, whatever. But I realized, like, and it's if someone takes a substance and they have like a certain basis of relating to these like core insights around non-duality and stuff, and probably many other like spiritual aspects of how you interpret the world and experience the world, uh sometimes these things can combine, and it doesn't really matter, or even you're completely sober, you might get into something that's more powerful than like a rather strong psychedelic trip, or it can be in that sort of territory. And there was this one trip that I had that was just incredibly profound. And when that happened and it was combined with like the insight that I had gained, going through the more traditional non-duality sort of stuff, um, it 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 just showed me so much of the relativity and subjectivity of experience, that it really experience could be formulated in so many different ways, and it can just show up in many different forms. And the human way of the human life that we have right now is like one tiny aspect of that, and there's so many other possibilities. And I was shown a I don't know, probably at least 10 different very radical possibilities of like ways that experience could be related to like in this 4-hour period. And up to that point, it was like the most beautiful and amazing experience of my life. But the next day when I came out of that, I was just found myself thinking that like this all, even this whole interpretation of these events as positive or as good is a subjective thing that's happening based on the current like kind of composition of experience as it's appearing right now. And I started to see that I started to get into this like nihilism where a lot of the, or really it felt like there was no meaning to anything. Even the most like amazing experience that you could have was ultimately just another sort of way that experience can be composed. And even going to higher spiritual levels seemed like it was kind of a game to me, like that ultimately had no meaning to it other than what it was felt like to the individual. And that put me in a very that led me to go into a very like deep depression. And it was probably the deepest depressive episode I'd ever had. But beyond that, it also came along with it like some very strange changes and sensations and perception. For like 2 or 3 days, I was probably about 3 days, I was in a like very strongly depersonalized state where it was like there was no hope of controlling anything that was going on, like with my body, my thoughts, anything. um and there was even a point in time like in that depersonalization, like I was holding like a lighter or a torch or something, and like I was about to like just mindlessly, outside of any control of a personality structure or myself, it was like thinking about like let's just like torch the leg for no reason. Like it was crazy. um and luckily that didn't happen, but it was just strange to see like that degree of separation from any sort of control of, you know, the, you know, human being that you supposedly are. And then also the loss of the a lot of the meaning that was felt before that experience. Like uh that was really dark. And I've, you know, that wasn't like something that stuck for me, that like nihilistic way of kind of interacting with the world. But it was like when it was first seen, just how many different formulations of experience there could possibly be. Well, I mean, I got like a large small glimpse of it, I might say. Like it was a very large glimpse of the possibilities of what experience could do, you know, relative to what most humans have had, especially in like a 4-hour period of time. It was very destabilizing to see that possibility. It's kind of like getting smacked in the head with infinity a few times. And so like the freshness of that realization of just how enormous the possibilities of experience are, it was hard to stomach. um and yeah, with the really strong sort of deep personalization coming along with that, it was very strange. But some of the weird sensations that I was having, it felt like and this is just so odd to say, but it felt like I could like feel a sensation of like organicness, almost kind of like sewage in my whole field of experience. Like the whole field of experience felt organic, you might say, but it had like this like sort of like very raw, like visceral, like organicness to it. that is so strange even now to try to remember what that was like. It doesn't sound like anything that crazy, but it didn't make any sense at the time what that felt like. Like it's kind of like instilling your interpretation of what sewage is, like excrement and stuff, and then like applying that to all the sensations in your field of experience and feeling like the organic, like kind of gross but interesting and also like goodness of it all at once. It just didn't make any sense. And you're like, what purpose does an experience like that even serve? It was kind of absurd in a sense. Like, but there were other strange things that happened around that time too. Like that, it was about 3 weeks before like it just got so bad. Like I had to get back on an antidepressant, and that cleared things up, allowed me to move out of it and like get back into more of a normal state of functioning. But like near the tail end of like those few weeks, I was actually like getting to a suicidal state where it was kind of a pretty serious like suicidal sort of state. And luckily, like one of the key non-duality insights, or at least Buddhist insights, or things that Buddhism focuses around a lot, kind of probably helped me a lot to not commit suicide. It was the realization this state itself is impermanent, the state of suffering, and I know for a fact it's going to break up and change it to something better. It's just a matter of time. So just like sit here and sit through the horrible experience for a bit, and it went away. Just like I could see that, I knew that it was going to, knew that ultimately the way that it was feeling right then was just a transient phase, and I came out of it. But it was really rough for a while. But there have been many other dark times for me along like the whole 8-year or so path that I've been on. But that was probably there were maybe 2 instances in the whole like journey that were that severe, and that's like one of them. But what about you? Or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I really loved your story, and it's such a story that shows like what's possible. Like it doesn't necessarily need to happen to you or like to anyone else in this exact way, but it can get really dark. You can get in like these shamanic type of dream stuff / whatever you want to call it, experiences where you're shown experiences which we don't have good ways of talking about in like conventional language, but experience is experience. That's what ultimately comes with this realization, and it feels just as real as anything else, really, or just as unreal as anything else, no matter how you want to put it. And it can be really, really disturbing, and the depressive states as well as like you hinted, and suicidal states. My lowest period was also a combination of like, I guess, a 2-3 month depression building up to like a suicidal state as well, where in hindsight I don't think I would have committed suicide, but I was suicidal. I was thinking of like throwing myself from the balcony at that stage. And yeah, these things can happen. Luckily you and I didn't do it. Like if someone is watching this and is thinking about suicide, it can happen that you feel suicidal, and please, it will pass. But
yeah, it will pass. That even for people in a like completely outside of the awakening context, that's really like one of the best things you can realize if you're in a suicidal state. If you can like have an authentic connection to that fact that this state will pass, it can ease things up a lot. But
yeah,
so
that was also my lowest point. I guess the funny thing is it taught me something. Like this lowest point of a path was also important for me. It was all of the things you said about like meaning and all these things really, really deeply resonated, but it also, at that point for me was, hey, this process is really, really rough. And
Yeah.
it's like almost like, you know, I can't stop it. There's no way back. I can't control it. I'm just like, I just have to like let go on a really deep level, like trust that this thing is gonna do something, hopefully good, but I don't know what, but it seems like it's gonna do it regardless of how much, you know, I
Yeah.
struggle to try and control it. And that was actually the moment when I deeply, deeply felt that and realized that. And that's where it really eased up. And I was like, 1 hour later, I'm just like coming out of the room and I'm no longer suicidal and I'm just chatting to my wife. But at that point, that really, really low point where I was just can't fight this anymore. I'm just gonna let go. Even if it means it's gonna kill me, it's gonna kill me. Really taught me something. It really changed something on a deep level. Yeah.
Yeah. I think as much as people talk negatively about the bad experiences on the path, I do think they ultimately show just as much that can be of like potential value as any of the more positive stuff. And like, for one, I mean, at the very least, it just shows you how one potential way that experience can manifest itself, one possible way that things can be. And maybe it shows you like uh a path that you don't want to have to be back in that place again too. But it's kind of like, when you see some of the more scary possibilities, I think it also mm, it creates a bit of resiliency in you, for me at least, where it's like any normal day, no matter how bad it possibly goes, it probably won't go to that degree, you know? And it's like, I made it through that and plenty of other of these difficult or disorienting or impossible to really make sense out of experiences. And it shows you that like your consciousness is sort of like um very strong in what it can handle, but it can ultimately handle like pretty much anything, you might say. But um, it, yeah, I mean, I guess that was one of the biggest things that I got out of these more difficult experiences was resiliency and just a confidence in the face of any traditional sort of suffering or bad mental state. It's, you know, I can handle this basically. And there I think there's something about like when you realize that you can handle like even some of the worst possibilities as far as your direct experience, you know, goes. It actually can like lighten up your fear and then lead to there being less stuff like that happening even in the first place. Like it just creates a better like acceptance in your way of relating to the world, for me at least.
Yeah, you put it in a very nice way. And likewise for me, very open to experiences which previously I wouldn't have been open to, like just the deep pain and sorrow and anger and all these dark aspects. Now I can deeply feel them, whereas before I couldn't, and everything felt very contracted. If I'm in a situation where I'm in pain, I'd be like physical and emotional, I'd contract a lot and be like, I don't like this pain, we need to get away from it. Whereas now it's like, it's pain. It's still painful, but it's like can open to it, or like, oh, it's anger, or it's like sorrow, or it's like shame, or it's guilt. All these like difficult emotions can really open up to them, and that feels very, very important. And the other thing that I actually found very important and transformational is also like going through these dark periods really somehow helps with connecting with others. It's just realizing how much these things hurt and how much pain and suffering is out there in the world that made me somehow more connected and compassionate towards others and more open to their suffering as well, which is also one of the things that I find the most motivational nowadays. I'm gonna lie if I say that from the start of this process, I was always gonna be like, hey, let's get awakened for the benefit of all beings. No, what happened with me was that I had to get this thing ramped in my system. So going through all of these dark periods, like at some point, eventually I was just like, this was just so painful. And then after that, in the aftermath of this like dark experience, I'd be like, hey, well, I love everyone. I love all beings. I love all people. I love all animals, all beings out there. I hope everyone is happy. I hope everyone can get awakened, and all these like cliches that maybe like are in Buddhism or in other traditions. But it really was my experience that these dark periods somehow were opening me up to that aspect of like experience as well. And one of the things that really, really motivates me nowadays. Yeah. Um, Talking about motivational things on the path, like how do you feel about that? Like what motivates you on the path, or what feels like important or significant for you on the path?
When you mean motivation, like what motivated me to like pursue spirituality, or like how did spirituality affect my motivation, like in various things in life? Like what, I don't know, what specific like way do you want me to talk about it?
Yeah, what I meant is more, yeah, I guess what motivated you to pursue spirituality, but also how did spirituality, or like the process that you've been through or you're going through, has changed, like ultimately what drives you, what motivates you in the world, what you find significant in the world. Yeah.
Hmm. Um, so uh I think really like the main motivation was to get out of suffering. Um, and it all and well, I would say maybe there were two main motivations, kind of equal. One one was to experience the most beautiful possibilities in life, and the other was to like get out of suffering. And it just it kind of functioned as like throughout the process, the more that I was shown the just stunning beauty of experience, and gaining a better understanding of what it's capable of, and what this thing is that I'm in, or this thing that I am, what how it all works. It it showed me that beauty, and then the loss of connection to that in various times was challenging, but overall it was just like I wanted to experience the best possible life for myself, and I wanted to get out of suffering that was caused by my mental illness and stuff like that. And I mean, at the end of the day, it worked really well for that purpose. For both giving me amazing experiences of life I could have never imagined, and then also taking away the bite of a lot of the sorrows and troubles of life, and making it a lot more palatable. And um, it's and as far as like motivation in a normal sense of like to go out and like make money or something, let's just say, like the maybe like the middle of my path, which I wouldn't say is like the middle of like the deeper non-duality path, like toward the end. Like I would say like there was kind of like an end phase but I'm not talking about that middle. I'm talking about like maybe in a regular like time sequence of like the 8 years that I've been doing this, maybe around like year 3 or 4, or maybe even 2 or 3, I started getting deeper experiences that were quite beautiful, but they were showing me that my motivations for life were ultimately flawed in a sense, because at that time I was really like success driven in the traditional sense, and I started to realize how that was ultimately an unfulfilling path. And my drives for what I wanted out of my life changed from more of like this materialistic way of, wanting things or status, and just that whole kind of success mentality that's very common, to like evaluating relationships more, and just living a more compassionate life with other people started to become more of a priority. And that started to make me a lot less motivated in the normal like success sense, um, for a while, for a period of at least like a few years. And then when we got into like the tail end of like the deeper awakenings and stuff like that, it uh, got to a point where I was pretty much motivated to do not like I wasn't motivated by anything, like, and a lot of that was because experience had become so satisfying on its own that it didn't feel like I needed to go out and pursue anything else. um and then after a time of basically like living a really chill life and not doing anything, um for like maybe 6 months pretty strongly, and then like for like another 6 months still doing some things, but way less than usual or what I had been doing before as far as like productivity and regular life goals go. So it was like a year where I kind of just like took it off from being motivated to pursue any normal worldly things or even like relationships a lot of the time. Like there was just so much less motivation to go pursue anything outside of what was happening in my own experience for a time. And eventually that let up, and I started to get this kind of zeal for life again, and want to go pursue traditional success or whatever in a bit more again. And one great thing that I've really been enjoying recently was like once I had gotten to a place where my experience started to become that satisfying, just on its own, uh, that and having the non-duality and like no self insights and these and plenty of other ones kind of fused into my experience, it made it where I could work a lot more effortlessly in the world and pursue things in a much more effortless fashion. And then I started going to the gym again recently, and I've just really been enjoying it. My motivations in life today are mainly just like try to create the most satisfying life as possible, where you're able to, be a positive person for other people when you interact with them, and uh, yeah, just kind of live a happy life for yourself. But I realized that, that's not just sitting around and being, satisfied on your couch. It's also like you can find a lot in traditional life still. There's can be a lot of value there. And even something like trying to get in shape again, to me, like that's just a fun project. It's just something that I like. I used to be into exercise and stuff when I was like my later years in high school, and it was a passion of mine. And it's like this whole awakening process has kind of helped fix my mental illness issues and the limitations that it had for me, or had imposed on me, you might say, for a while. It's kind of taken a lot of the power out of those limitations and given me like more of a normal life again, and where I'm able to, pursue stuff and work hard and have higher energy levels and motivation in general. So that's kind of where that all has gone for me recently. Um, what about you? How has motivation been affected like on your path, and like what was the motivation to start yours?
Yeah.
I think, let me see the time. Yeah, I think this is probably the last like kind of question I can do
Yeah,
before
yeah,
uh,
let's
wrap
just
up.
yeah, let's wrap up after this one. Yeah, I really loved your answer before I go into mine. I really loved your answer, so much wisdom and like healthy way of relating to this in it. And for me, what this has changed is likewise, I value relationships a lot more nowadays and just showing up in each and every moment, trying to do what feels good, what feels right, from a like more caring, altruistic position. This has definitely changed for me. And likewise, I feel somehow more motivated to try and make the world a better place, whatever
Mhm.
better means, in whatever ways like I can from like my limited position of an ordinary human being. But I do feel motivated to do that. And I found myself also a lot more like extrovert. I've actually been quite introvert for large periods of my life, but nowadays I'm actually very extrovert. Somehow this process like has really opened me up to connecting with people and sharing and helping with whatever I can. As part of that, I've also been drawn to, I guess, getting in touch with more people that are going through something similar, and like I guess talking to them as like a spiritual buddy, as I call it. And you
Mhm.
also do that as well, from what I know. And I feel that's quite important nowadays because so many people out there land in these territories, and some of these people can really benefit from like talking to someone that's been through some of that and can relate to it in a healthy way, without some of the drawbacks of like the necessarily the teacher-student relationship, which necessarily has a built-in hierarchy, and also a lot of the teachers of course charge money, etc., so not always accessible for everyone. So it feels like something that's important for me right now to do that more of. Yeah.
Hmm. Well, yeah, that's cool. What was the motivation to pursue like awakening for you though at the start?
Well, I guess I wanted to get out of suffering. That's pretty much like I realized the deep
Yeah.
offness of life, the deep offness being a synonym of suffering. And I was just like, this thing, and my life was not bad. Like by conventional terms, I had a family and a job and like friends and all these things. So my life wasn't bad in conventional sense, but really felt off, like deeply unsatisfactory on some deep fundamental level. Something didn't make sense. I'm just like, too constricted. It's like something's off. Need to figure this out. And I guess that was
Yeah.
probably my motivation. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I guess seeing that we've advanced with time, would you like to add something or before we wrap up, or does this feel like a good place to wrap this one up?
I don't have anything more to like anything like last second to add really. I think we covered a lot. Um, I hope some people who see this can get some value out of it and maybe make things seem a little bit more normal for them if they're going through some of this stuff.
Yeah, hopefully this content is beneficial for others. And if you feel like you want to get in touch with one of us, of course, we'll also share our contact details in the video descriptions as we publish it. So yeah, it's good talking to you, Brandon. I really appreciate your time and the wisdom you brought to this conversation. And I'd love to talk to you again soon in one of these again. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, we can do it again sometime. Maybe go a little more in depth to some of the stuff we didn't get to cover as much today.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was fun, man. I think we gave a pretty good um, sort of introduction into what this process might be like for someone, to where they can see both the good and the bad that come with it, which I think
Yeah.
is important, because a lot of people might first hear about spirituality and think that it's just going to be the most awesome thing the whole time and there's no downsides, but that's not the reality for most people, at least.
No, it's much more turbulent than that, and I think we covered that quite well. Would love to go a bit more in detail on some of these, yeah, in another time. Yeah, great talking to you.